We're going to talk about the three most common ways. The first is CPM. This means cost per meal. And it doesn't mean cost per million. It means cost per thousand. I think meal, M-I-L, have Latin roots. It must be like Latin. Cost per meal. Cost per thousand downloads is the most common way that most people try to monetize. But it is the worst way as the three ways that I'm talking about today. This is the worst of the three ways. So I'm going to share what CPM is. I'm going to explain how it works. And then I'm going to share with you a better way. I'm going to explain how that works and how people get a hold of people, because you make a lot more than your CPM model. And then I'm going to explain the third way, which is the way that you can make the absolute most amount of money. CPM, cost per meal, means that if it means an advertiser who, and here's kind of like the caveat to it, and it's an advertiser, they don't necessarily have your same avatar. They're just more of like a general audience advertiser. And so you might have a real estate show. You might have the podcast on podcasting. You might have a show about your health and wellness. You might have something about piloting. You might have something about, aviation or we can just talk about millions of these things. Education. We can talk about movies, whatever your podcast is about. If you were going to go with a CPM model, that would mean that you would get an advertiser on that had a general ad. They're usually about 30 seconds or a minute long. So that advertiser, they wouldn't even really conversate with you. They would end up just putting up their ads in your place. And so one of the ways that we do this is there's some platforms out there that allow these ads to happen automatically. And when I say automatically, they can be dynamic ads, which means they can do it to episodes that you've already been published, that have already been published. You published a long time ago, and they just basically push a button, and then the 1, 2, 3, or 4 different ads, 1, 2, 3, 4 different ads will all play on your podcast. And when it's a dynamic ad insertion, that's going to mean that there's going to be a 30-second ad followed by another 30-second ad, followed by maybe a 1-minute ad, followed by a 30-second ad. And that's before you ever give anybody value. That's it. Before anyone ever hears anything on the podcast, before you've said anything good, they get bombarded with these CPM model advertisements. One might be about diapers. One might be about home improvement. Another might be about a meal prep service. And the fourth one might be in Spanish or some other language that you don't even understand, and neither does your listener. And this is a real story. This is an actual true story. And so do you want the CPM model? Maybe. So far, it doesn't sound very enticing, does it? They don't even share my same avatar, you're thinking. Well, if they're not going to help my perfect person, why do I want them? Well, you might not want them at all. You probably don't. And how do I get paid? That's your next question. How do I get paid with CPM? Well, most of these places, they will say, hey, I'm going to give $5 CPM. Or if they're really have a lot of money to throw around, they're going to say $20 CPM. And if you found a way to just get the cream of the crop, the best of the best, you might get $30 CPM. What does that mean? That means that per 1,000 listeners that you have. So think about it. How many listeners do you have? The average podcast has about 100 listeners. A top 10% podcast has about 300 listeners. The average one has about 100. A top 10% has 300. A top 1% podcast has about 3,500 downloads per episode.